History is filled with the stories of great battles, heroic charges, and famous last stands. But perhaps the single most important act of defiance in modern history happened not on a battlefield, but deep beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean, inside the sweltering, claustrophobic confines of a Soviet submarine. It was an act performed not by a general or a president, but by a quiet, unassuming naval officer who, in the single most dangerous moment of the Cold War, said one simple word: no. This man's name was Vasili Arkhipov, and on October 27, 1962, he was the sole reason you are able to listen to this story today. This is the incredible, terrifying, and largely unknown story of the day the world was saved from nuclear apocalypse by the quiet courage of one man who refused to end it. To understand the events of that day, we must first descend into the paranoid, high-stakes world of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, the world held its breath. The Soviet Union, under Premier Nikita Khrushchev, had secretly installed nuclear-armed missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of the United States. When American spy planes discovered the missile sites, President John F. Kennedy initiated a naval quarantine of the island, a blockade in all but name to prevent any more Soviet ships from arriving. The two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were now locked in a terrifying nuclear standoff. U.S. forces were at DEFCON 2, the highest level of military readiness short of actual war. B-52 bombers carrying nuclear weapons were in the air, 24 hours a day. An invasion force was gathering in Florida. The world had never been closer to a full-scale nuclear exchange, a war that would have meant the end of civilization as we know it. Sailing directly into the heart of this crisis was a flotilla of 4 Soviet submarines. They were diesel-electric boats from the B-59 class, known to NATO as the Foxtrot class. Their mission was to evade the American blockade and rendezvous with Soviet ships near Cuba. But these submarines carried a secret that the Americans did not know. Each one was armed with a single, devastatingly powerful special weapon, a nuclear-armed torpedo. Each of these torpedoes had a yield roughly equivalent to the bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima. They were not strategic weapons to be launched only on the order of Moscow. They were tactical weapons, and the authority to launch them had been given to the captains of the submarines themselves. The conditions aboard these submarines were horrendous. The Foxtrot class was not designed for the warm waters of the Caribbean. The air conditioning systems failed, and the temperature inside the metal hulls soared to over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick with diesel fumes and carbon dioxide. The crews were exhausted, dehydrated, and rationing water. For weeks, they had been sailing in near-to-total radio silence to avoid detection, cut off from the world, with no real understanding of how close the planet was to how out war. Our story focuses on one of these submarines, the B-59. Its captain was a man named Valentines, but crucially, because this flotilla was on such an important mission, the overall commander of the submarine group, Vasili Alexandrovich Arkhipov. On October 27, 1962, a day that would later be known as Black Saturday, the Cuban Missile Crisis reached its fever pitch. An American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot. The hawks in the Kennedy administration were screaming for immediate military retaliation. The world was on a razor's edge. At that exact moment, deep in the Sargasso Sea, the submarine B-59 was finally detected by the American Navy. A massive U.S. task force, consisting of the aircraft carrier, USS Randolph, and 11 destroyers, began to hunt the B-59. For hours, the submarine was relentlessly pursued. The American ships began dropping practice depth charges. These were small, grenade-sized explosives, designed not to destroy the submarine, but to force it to the surface for identification, a signaling method that the Soviets had not been properly informed about. Imagine the scene inside the B-59. The crew is exhausted, running on fumes, in blistering heat. For weeks, they have been cut off from Moscow, with no idea if war has already broken out. All they know is that they are being hunted. And then, the explosions begin. The small depth charges detonate near the hull, causing the entire submarine to shudder violently. The lights flicker and die. The crew is thrown about in the darkness. From their perspective, they are under attack. They do not know these are practice charges. To them, an explosion is an explosion. War has begun. The captain of the submarine, Valentin Savitsky, was pushed to his breaking point. He was convinced that they were being destroyed, that World War III had started above them. In a state of rage and exhaustion, he made a fateful decision. He screamed, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy." He ordered the crew to prepare the special weapon for launch. He was going to fire the nuclear torpedo. The target was the massive aircraft carrier, the USS Randolph. Had that torpedo been launched, the result would have been instantaneous and apocalyptic. The carrier and its escort ships would have been vaporized in a nuclear fireball. The United States would have, without question, interpreted this as the first shot in a full-scale nuclear war and launched a massive retaliatory strike against the Soviet Union. The doomsday clock would have struck midnight. The carefully managed crisis would have spiraled into Armageddon within minutes. But there was a crucial safeguard. The protocol for launching the nuclear torpedo required the unanimous consent of the 3 senior officers on board: Captain Savitsky, the ship's political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, and the flotilla commander, Vasili. Savitsky gave the order. The political officer, Maslenikov, reportedly gave his consent. 2 of the 3 keys were ready to be turned. The fate of the world now rested on the shoulders of one man, Vasili Arkhipov. Arkhipov stood firm. He refused to give his consent. An intense, furious argument erupted in the cramped control room. Savitsky, convinced they were under attack and facing certain death, screamed at Arkhipov that they had to fire. But Arkhipov was a calmer, more level-headed presence. His previous experience with the K-19 disaster had taught him the importance of keeping a cool head in a crisis. He had felt the heat of a failing reactor. The sound of practice depth charges did not panic him in the same way. He argued that they had no proof they were under attack in a declared war. They had been out of contact with Moscow for days. He reasoned that these explosions were not designed to sink them, or they would already be dead. He argued that to launch the torpedo without direct orders from Moscow, based on incomplete information, was an unacceptable risk. He was the voice of reason in a room filled with heat, fear, and fury. He was the one man who stood between his captain's panicked finger and the nuclear button. He talked Savitsky down. He vetoed the launch. Instead of firing, Arkhipov convinced the captain to surface the submarine and await orders from Moscow. As the B-59 emerged from the depths, it found itself in the center of the powerful American naval fleet. It was forced to hoist the Soviet flag and allow itself to be identified. The standoff was tense, but it was not violent. The B-59 eventually received orders from Moscow to turn back. The immediate crisis was over. No one on the American side knew how close they had come to annihilation. They had no idea that the submarine they had been harassing was nuclear-armed, or that a furious argument about ending the world had just taken place hundreds of feet beneath them. It wasn't until 40 years later, at a conference in Havana in 2002 commemorating the crisis, that the full story came out. Robert McNamara, the U.S. Secretary of Defense during the crisis, was in attendance. When the former Soviet officers revealed the details of what had happened aboard the B-59, McNamara and the other American attendees were stunned into silence. They realized that the world had not been saved by the brilliant diplomacy of Kennedy or the strategic calculations of Khrushchev, but by the refusal of a single, unknown Soviet naval officer to give his consent. Arthur Schlesinger, a historian and advisor to President Kennedy, would later say, "This was not only the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, it was the most dangerous moment in human history. And the man who saved U.S. from that moment was not a president or a premier, but a submarine commander who had the clarity of mind to question his orders and the moral courage to say no." Vasili Arkhipov continued his naval career and eventually rose to the rank of vice admiral. He passed away in 1998, his incredible, world-saving act of defiance still largely unknown to the public. He is, without question, one of the most important unsung heroes of the 20th century. His story is a chilling and powerful ember from the Cold War. It is a reminder that the great forces of history can sometimes pivot on the quiet decision of a single individual, deep in the shadows, far from the halls of power. It is a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest act of bravery is not to fire the weapon, but to be the one person who refuses to turn the key.